What right do I have to experience joy when my grandparents died in Auschwitz? I quote this in The Myth of Normal. My friend and colleague and teacher, Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, he said to me once, Gabo, you don't have to drag Auschwitz around with you all the time, which means that you don't have to allow, not to forget about Auschwitz, but not to let that control your consciousness, which means you do have the right to feel joy. You do have the right to be happy, even as the world suffers. Not because the world suffers, and not ignoring the suffering in the world, but there's no contradiction. The way that fear shows up in most people's lives is in the form of anxiety. See, we are wired for fear. There's a great neuropsychologist, died a few years ago before his time, Dr. Panksepp, and he identified all these emotional circuits that we share with other mammals. And fear was one of them. We have a circuitry for fear. Good thing. If we're not afraid, we die out there in nature, you know. But that can become anxiety. I want to show you this bracelet that I'm wearing.
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful, and I never thought I'd ever be wearing a bracelet. So I was giving a trauma workshop there for Haida people. That's when they gave me this bracelet. And the meaning of the carvings means these words matter. At the end of 2 days, almost at the very end of the trauma workshop for the Haida people, a woman in her 70s at least comes up. And she said, I used to speak perfect Haida until I was 5 years old. And then I forgot my language. And even when I've gone back to school as an adult to learn my native language, the words don't stick in my brain. And I said, what happened to you? Well, what happened to her? She went to these residential schools where the indigenous kids were forced to go, run by the churches mostly, and she dared speak her native language. And the teacher took a stick and beat her mercilessly in her body, in her head, and her limbs. Oh, native kids in my own lifetime is when I was a teenager in British Columbia. A 4-year-old Indian, they're not Indians, indigenous Canadian, First Nation kid, spoke their own language, they'd have a pin stuck in her tongue. So I said to her, look, you're losing your language. Was your organism protecting you? It was your fear system telling you that if you do that again, you might not survive. Because she hated herself for it. She hated herself for the anxiety. She hated herself because I was so passive, she said. I said, that passivity was your organism's only way to protect you. Because had you fought back, or had you asserted your right to speak your language, much worse would have happened to you. So that fear protected her. But it translates into anxiety, where it's no longer fear of a specific thing, it's just fear of the world. Now, the rate of anxiety, so we have a system for fear. And the greatest danger to a young child is the loss of relationship. Because without relationship, we can't survive. I mean, we're defenseless, we're vulnerable, we're helpless. So the loss of protective adults is the biggest fear that the child has. In this society, a lot of parents can't be there for their kids the way they need to be, the way they want to be, because of the stresses, economic, social, racial, political, whatever they're going through, just the nature of the disconnected culture that we live in. Parents are not there for their kids the way the children need to be. The fear becomes chronic anxiety, that we're never safe. And now that becomes part of our sense of self. So what you say, but this lack of emotional safety, what it actually is that early childhood fear. Because when a child is afraid, they will ask for help. But when repeatedly the help is not available, and the adults don't come because they're too busy, too stressed, too traumatized, too preoccupied, too downtrodden, or too propagandized by parenting experts to ignore their kids' cries, the child gets the message that there's no safety. So that original fear that's meant to result in a cry for help now becomes chronic anxiety. So fear not dealt with gets ingrained as anxiety. It's no longer about anything specific. It's just being in the world is a source of fear, which it shouldn't be.
It almost feels like, as you were saying, that what should result in a cry for help externally becomes a perpetual cry internally.
That's exactly it.
Without a feeling of being able to help yourself.
Exactly.